All right, thank you for joining us. I'm going to introduce Rob Dobbs. He is the non-game avian ecologist for the Wildlife Diversity Program with Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, where he works to identify the status and distributions, habitat associations, and factors limiting populations of bird species of greatest conservation need, and to facilitate management actions and research and monitoring programs for their benefit. Rob is an avid birder in his free time, active in the birding community, particularly through the Louisiana Ornithological Society, and involved in numerous outreach efforts to engage the public in birding and the value of Louisiana's avifauna. And he has also presented to the Baton Rouge Audubon Society many times in the past. So thank you very much for continuing to come and entertain us. All right. Yeah, we'll switch.
Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight to talk about this, which is a new initiative that we're getting going within the Wildlife Diversity Program. And part of this, part of the success of this program is going to hinge on, volunteer participation. In many ways, this is a community science type project, or it has the potential to be. And so, one of my goals tonight is to present with y'all enough information so that you would know, hey, if this is of interest, you would have the details necessary to know or to make a decision. Well, I might actually want to try this or not. So first, I'm going to start off talking about sort of nightjars in general, talk a fair bit about our Louisiana nightjars, the species that occurred here, and then talk about the monitoring itself and go through the details of the survey protocol. Katie just provided a lot of this information, so I won't go into too much detail, but why am I, Robert Dobbs, Wildlife Diversity Program, here talking about this? As Katie mentioned, we are responsible with conservation of non-game animals and plant species in Louisiana. We're a 12-ish person program. And one of the things that we do to accomplish this is we maintain a state wildlife action plan, right? That's essentially a roadmap for non-game species conservation. And among its functions, one of the things that we use it for is to allocate state wildlife grant funding, right? State wildlife grant is a federal source of funding that is allocated to the states to recover, conserve imperiled species before they get to the point where they need to actually be listed, say, under the endangered species list. One component of the wildlife action plan that forms kind of a framework for it is that we maintain a list of species of greatest conservation need, or SGCNs. I might refer to that tonight. And these are the species. It's exactly what it sounds like, right? There are a number of criteria that go into this, determining if a species is an SGCN based on its rarity, number of populations in the state, are they declining? What the population trend is, and a number of things that we do for SGCN. We are engaged in monitoring and tracking these populations, identifying threats, and facilitating conservation actions for them. The three species of Louisiana nightjars, and I'm jumping ahead just slightly, are species of greatest conservation need under the currently revised state wildlife action plan that's being published this year. But first, I want to, before we get into that Louisiana species, I want to talk about nightjars in general. What are nightjars? So nightjars are birds within the family Caprimulgidae. And so these are sort of typical nightjars that you've probably heard of, like whippoorwill, right? And this is a common poorwill. This is a bird that lives in the western U.S. And then also nighthawks, right? So these two different groups, they have different ecologies. They're actually different subfamilies, nightjars on the one hand and nighthawks on the other hand, but they're both within the Caprimulgidae family. Caprimulgidae is Latin for milker of goats, right? So you might have heard these birds referred to as goat suckers. That comes from a really old myth, but it actually is still used among modern day biologists, which is pretty interesting. And I'm going to circle back to that in just a second. But, to give you a little more context for what these birds are and what they do, these are crepuscular and nocturnal birds. And so crepuscular means that they're active during twilight, so at dusk and at dawn. So low light, but some ambient light typically. And then also nocturnally, at least primarily the nightjars, right? Like whippoorwill. These birds are lunar philic, right? They're moon loving. It simply means that they're more active when the moon is brighter. And that's because they need some ambient light to forage. Like, so they have dusk, dawn, there's some ambient light. And then during the night, they're most active when there's some moonlight. Because they're visual predators. They're aerial insectivores, but they use their eyes to spot these flying insects. So moths, beetles. They have really large eyes, disproportionately large eyes, an adaptation to see under these low light conditions. A small bill, as you can see on this bird, but a really large gape. If this bird was to open its bill, it has a really big mouth, right? And so that's an adaptation to be able to capture these flying insects. They also have rictal bristles, which are these little filaments, these long black filaments that come out from around the base of the bill. A lot of birds that forage this way, like kingbirds and wood pewees, which are flycatchers, have these rictal bristles. And these function in a tactile sort of way. So the bird sees the prey, flies after it, gets close, and then perhaps it gets close enough to feel it with one of these rictal bristles, and then acts as provides a cue to actually, for the bird to turn and attack where that cue is coming from. They're very poorly known birds, right? They're very secretive, active at night or under low light conditions, super cryptic plumage across the board. This poor will shows that, vermiculated patterns of earth tones, grays, browns, blacks, and sort of warmish, warm tan colors. And they have really limited vocal activity, really, outside of the breeding season, right? When they're breeding, when chuck-wills, widows are on the breeding grounds, they're pretty conspicuous. But outside of that season, these birds don't sing, and their calls are really inconspicuous, tend to be these sort of low guttural churs and groans and things like that. The goat sucker, I have to return to that. So again, these birds are foraging, at night or under low light conditions, and they're going after insects. Goat sucker, again, which gave rise to the family name Capromulgidae, is from like the 4th century BC. Aristotle talked about this, and it arises from this myth that that came from goat herders basically associating the presence of these birds with their livestock sort of exuding milk in the morning. So the goat herders would hear these birds, see these birds around their stock. They were probably there on drawn in by the insect availability, right, associated with the livestock. And then they would notice in the morning, well, some of my animals, even though they should have milk, are actually exuding some milk. And so somehow that association was made, and the family name was born, and it's still used today in a common name, goatsucker. And then related to that, another kind of cool component of these birds is that there's a very rich folklore around these birds. For like whippoorwill in North America, European nightjar in Europe, and kind of across the globe, these birds tend to be associated with the macabre, right? So they're active at night, they're very poorly known, and so as humans, we tend to draw some parallels with the macabre. So in many cases, whippoorwills and nightjars in general are associated with death, or precursor to death, or perhaps in some myths they represent the souls of dead children and crazy stuff like that, right? But it's a really fascinating component of these birds' cultural significance. There's 98 species of nightjars and nighthawks in the world, among 23 genera. They're distributed worldwide, right? All the continents except Antarctica, of course. These birds are insectivorous. And there are a number of northern species, which are migratory. So you can see the pink shading in North America. That's representing, eastern whippoorwill and common nighthawk and that sort of thing. All these birds in the northern latitudes are migratory. Most of the species diversity, like in many birds, are within the tropics. But across the board, they're all sort of, for the most part, variations on this theme of a relatively, small bird, like robin-sized-ish bird, that are these, big-headed, tend to be flat-crowned shaped birds with big eyes and some pattern of these earth tones. There are a couple of really cool exceptions that I have to point out. You can see a couple of them here. So this is the lyre-tailed nightjar. And again, these are sort of the exceptions to the rule, but I want to talk about them because they're really cool. So in this case, sexual selection, which is driven by female choice for some quality in a male that tends to be associated with male fitness, drives the development of these exaggerated traits. In this case, it's a really, really long tail. So this bird lives in the Andes. These birds are probably not territorial. These birds are more than likely polygynous, and males display and females choose mates based on the length of their tails. And this one is my favorite. This is a standard wing nightjar. There are two species that have these sort of wing adaptations. These are African birds. In this bird, it's not the tail feathers that are exaggerated. It's two primaries, one primary on each wing, that are really long. And along the vast majority of the rachis, they don't have barbs, right? The barbs are confined to the tips of the wings. These birds, again, kind of like lyre-tailed nightjar, they perform in these mating or display arenas like leks, like prairie chickens or manakins, and females choose males based on their display and the sexiness of their standard wings. But these are as cool as they are. They're kind of the exception, or so we think, right? In most nightjars, males and females are pretty similar. Mating systems are probably, socially monogamous, sort of what we think of as sort of quote unquote typical. Although there's much we don't know about these birds worldwide. This is one of the most poorly studied families of birds in the world, as well as in Louisiana. A little bit more about water nightjars with respect to their evolutionary relationships. So this is a phylogenetic tree. It's actually an artistic rendition of a phylogenetic tree that actually looks like an actual tree branch, right? But in a phylogenetic tree, the branching patterns here reflect evolutionary relationships. And so this is the Strysorius clade. All these birds originated from a common ancestor. So at the base here are our nightjars that we're talking about today. And within the circle, their closest relatives are the other non-owl nightbirds, right? So the oilbird, which is a primarily South American, Central American bird, one of the coolest birds in the world, probably in terms of its behavior. This bird is a nocturnal frugivore, which is pretty outrageous in and of itself, but it also nests communally and roosts communally in caves, which is just crazy, crazy. They're really closely related to the potus, which is a small, again, neotropical family. And then in Asia, there are the frogmouths. They're somewhat potu-like. Those occur in Southeast Asia and in Australasia, and then the owlet nightjars in Australasia. And interestingly, at the tip of this evolutionary branch are the hummingbirds and the swifts, which is pretty unexpected. In Louisiana, we have 5 species of Caprimulgidae on the state list. The eastern whippoorwill on the left, we consider that a spring and fall migrant only. Historically nested in northwestern Louisiana. There are no recent records, as in the last 5 decades plus, probably. And so we're considering them only a spring and fall migrant. They're transient only. They move through in both of those seasons. We have 2 breeding species, right? Chuckwill's widow, which is very similar to eastern whippoorwill in most aspects, same genus, Antrostomus. And then common nighthawk, which again is that different subfamily, very different ecology. And then we have 2 rare species. One is the lesser nighthawk, which rare but regular. There's over 30 records now accepted by the Bird Records Committee, but still, very rare. Primarily a spring occurring bird, and primarily occurs on the southwestern coastal Cheniers when it does show up. And then we have 1 record of Antillean nighthawk. Antillean nighthawk is a Caribbean species, and there's 1 record for the summer of 1977 in New Orleans. Very similar to common nighthawk, and recognizing its voice is key in separating it from common nighthawk. And so I want to go in and talk, in detail about our 3 regularly occurring birds, nightjars, that is. So whippoorwill, if you look at that big map, this is a pretty widely distributed bird in eastern North America, right? There's sort of 2 areas of breeding, sort of the Missouri, Arkansas area, and then east through Tennessee, Kentucky, and the Appalachians, and sort of a gap in the Midwestern, former prairie, current ag landscape. And then again, breeding populations in the far north, Great Lakes area, Ontario, and across. Within Louisiana, which is the inset and the yellow dots. So the red areas are breeding seasons, June and July. and the yellow areas are transient only. Again, those migrants. They're pretty rare, but occur in the Florida parishes, but primarily are occurring when they do show up in northwestern Louisiana. We're very data limited for all aspects of eastern whippoorwill biology in Louisiana. Most reports are, anecdotal. Spring passage dates, as we understand them, early March to late April, with a peak from early April to mid to late April. And I'm not going to go into much detail on how to identify these birds visually. Like 99% of the time, if you detect one of these birds, it's going to be by its song, right? So I do want to talk about song. So like the next species, like common whippoorwill that we talked about earlier, its common name is an onomatopoeic representation of its song. In this case, it's a 3-syllable song, whippoorwill, with the emphasis on the last syllable. And so that's really important to think about that song, and we're going to compare it to Chuck Will's Widow in a minute. It's close relative. We don't really know how important Louisiana is for eastern whippoorwills. Again, if you remember the slide I just showed, most of our records are relatively anecdotal, right? But this is recent work. This is unpublished for the most part. GPS tag work that's done by Dr. Mike Ward and collaborators. Dr. Ward's out of the University of Illinois, and they've been putting GPS tags on it's close to 150 birds, I think, represented in this slide. So these tags are going on birds in multiple areas across the breeding range, from Minnesota area, Wisconsin, and then across east through the Midwest and into New England and the Appalachians. And what's showing here is the movement of these birds based on those GPS fixes in fall migration. And you can see that a lot of those birds are passing through Louisiana, probably way more than we realize, right? And so, really begs the question, is Louisiana an important link for this species during migration? Based on the anecdotal reports that we have, we wouldn't think so. Based on this, maybe, what is the importance of the stopover habitat in Louisiana for these birds? It may be, relatively underappreciated at this point. So we want to eventually, and not so much in the monitoring that I'm talking about tonight, but eventually understand how common whippoorwills are during migration in Louisiana. When and where do they occur? What habitats do they use? What are effects of forest management? Might a handful even actually breed, at least irregularly, in northern Louisiana? With respect to Chuck Will's Widow, and this is really what we're going to focus on for the monitoring that we talk about shortly. This bird is kind of a southern cousin of the whippoorwill. Again, same genus, a more southern distribution. Throughout from central Texas through the Carolinas, much more coastal, really, in habitat use, at least in the eastern part of the range. Not so much in Louisiana and Texas. But again, like the previous map, the red here is showing breeding distribution. And so in Louisiana, it's kind of similar to eastern whippoorwill, right? So low density, but regular in the Florida parishes. And then the core of the breeding population in the state is in western Louisiana and northern Louisiana. Spring arrival begins first week of April, peaks in mid to late April. Again, not going to talk about the visual ID of these birds, but it's a bigger bird, as you can't see that in this photo, but it is a bigger bird. You can see in this photo that it's a much sort of richer brown, warmer brown coloration bird. And the song, in my opinion, Chuck Will's Widow doesn't really do a good job in portraying the song. To me, it's more like Chuck Widow. That middle syllable has 2 notes, and I'm going to play it here. So it's similar, but slightly different. And one thing I want to do to really point that out, if I can get this to play. Well, That's the Chuck Will's Widow song "Slow Down" by half, basically. So you can really hear those two notes in that middle phrase, as opposed to whippoorwill. Doesn't want to play for me. You can really hear that emphasis on the last note, and the lack of that double note in the middle. Chuck Will's Widow, like Eastern Whippoorwill, we're very data limited on most aspects of this bird's biology in Louisiana. That's a Chuck Will's Widow egg that I found in northern Louisiana. So nightjars in general don't build nests. They simply lay their eggs on the ground, in this case on the forest floor. Breeding habitat in Louisiana, we really all we have to go on at this point that's been documented are sort of these generalized comments like pine dominated uplands or mixed deciduous pine to uplands, have very little information on specific habitat preferences or more granular information. So need more information on that, on response to management, response to prescribed fire, timber management, and so on. And then common nighthawk, our last species. I'm going to spend less time on this bird, which I think will make sense in a minute because our monitoring is really going to focus on Chuck Will's Widow. But I do want to talk about it a little bit. This is a very widespread in North America as a breeder. In Louisiana, much different distribution pattern than we've talked about so far. These birds are really closely tied to the coastal zone. And these birds are habitat generalists, and they require open areas for nesting. The other species we've talked about are more forest birds, right? These birds like really open areas like mainland beaches, barrier islands, as is shown here. And these birds are really quite different. They're more active during the daytime, right? They are crepuscular, but they trend toward that daytime end of the crepuscular period as opposed to the nighttime end when our typical nightjars are more active. These birds forage like swallows or swift, right? They're pretty high usually and just constantly taking prey on the wing. So why are we really concerned about monitoring in the first place? I mentioned that these birds are SGCN. One reason that they're SGCN is that they are declining very rapidly, right? And so like many guilds of North American birds, they're in steep decline. You've probably heard of this 3 billion birds lost phrase. It refers to a paper that was published 5 years ago that used a number of data sources, but largely the breeding bird survey data set, which is a long-term continent-wide data set to document just massive bird declines throughout North America. Aerial insectivores are among the most steeply declining guilds. This is using some of those same data, but it's from a State of Canada birds report, and I simply use it because they break out aerial insectivores among the guilds that they're looking at with respect to degree of population decline. We think of shorebirds and grassland birds as our most sharply declining bird guilds, and they certainly are, but aerial insectivores are right there as well. The data in the box here, these are from the breeding bird survey. So with respect to Eastern Whippoorwill, about 69% population loss over the last 50 years. I'm showing the BVS trends here as well, but the main take home is almost 70% based on the breeding bird survey decline. So this is a Partners in Flight yellow watch list species. And then Chuck Will's Widow and common nighthawk, very similar Partners in Flight tan watch list species, and they've declined, somewhere around 60% over the last 50 years. eBird trend data can also be used, or eBird status and trend data can also be used to look at population trends, and those data show very similar patterns, only going back to 2012 when eBird has been really utilized. And so the breeding bird survey is an incredibly important tool, right? It's really the data set that we can use to look at changes in bird populations. It started in 1966, so it's a really long-term program. It's very widespread, like 3,700 routes in North America and Canada. So it really does a good job in providing us information with which to look at population declines. But it's a daytime protocol, right? Breeding bird surveys start 1/2 hour before sunrise, so in that twilight period. But breeding bird survey routes are 50 different point stops. So you're only going to pick up a whippoorwill or a chuckwill's widow, right? Maybe in the first one, maybe the first two stops. So it's not a good protocol for evaluating nightjar populations. Same with eBird. Very few eBirders are out there birding with some sort of rigorous protocol at night. And so nobody doubts that nightjar populations are declining rapidly, but there is some uncertainty, right, as to the degree of this. In fact, it could be worse than we understand currently, based on BBS or breeding bird survey. So population estimate and trend data are based on inadequate sampling protocols, and hence, why we're initiating this, right? We want to start a long-term monitoring program similar to the breeding bird survey, but focused on Louisiana nightjars. And so I'll also mention that this is part of a bigger effort throughout the Mississippi Flyway. Mississippi Flyway states are trying to emphasize nightjar monitoring starting essentially now. The Atlantic Flyway has started this in recent years. And so there is a growing recognition of the need for this. And there's actually a protocol already in existence, an established protocol that I'll talk about shortly. But for Louisiana's effort for year one this year, we're going to focus on chuckwill's widow, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is it sort of limits our geographic scope, right? This being the first year, this being somewhat dependent on volunteer effort and participation. We want to be able to sort of evaluate how successful this is going to be before going, full scale, perhaps. And so what we're going to do is use established breeding bird survey routes that are within the chuckwill's widow range in Louisiana. This is the chuckwill's widow range in Louisiana. Probably looks familiar from one of those previous maps. And then these are the breeding bird survey routes that occur either within that shaded range or within 10 miles of it. So there's 28 such routes. So that's our lofty goal, is to get these routes surveyed this year. Let me go back real quick to here. So that's the where. That's pretty straightforward. The when these surveys occur is a little more complicated, right? So it's only one survey per year, like the breeding bird survey. It's going to be during May or June, which is very similar to the breeding bird survey as well. But there are a few details that make this timing up these surveys a little bit challenging. One is that they must occur within the gibbous moon. That's when the moon face is more than half illuminated, and I'm going to talk more about that momentarily. And then the protocol for these surveys is that they must start at least 30 minutes after sunset, and they must be completed at least 30 minutes before sunrise when the moon is above the horizon. And that's another tricky part of this, is that when the moon is above the horizon varies within that cycle. So moonrise is later and later and later throughout that gibbous cycle from waxing to waning. And so I want to talk a little bit about this in detail. So this is the typical moon cycle, right? You have the new moon, it's dark, there's zero illumination. Then you have a waxing crescent moon. You have a crescent moon, it's getting bigger, bigger every night until you get to the first quarter, right? First quarter moon is half illuminated. Between then and the full moon, bigger and bigger, full moon. And then you have the waning gibbous. The moon is still greater than half illuminated, but it's getting smaller every night until you get to the third quarter. As we've talked about previously, these birds tend to be more active and more vocal when the moon is illuminated, or is, we'll say more than half illuminated. So that's the period we have to focus on for these surveys. And so that's about the 8 days before a full moon and the 7 or 8 days after a full moon. And then I also mentioned that moonrise varies throughout this period, right? The moon has to be above the horizon. So in the 8 days or so preceding the full moon, you can go out and start your survey according to the protocol at 30 minutes after sunset, and the moon will already be above the horizon because moon rises during the daytime, right? And it won't set until later in the evening. So you have a few hours to do your survey early in the evening, and these surveys take about an hour and 45 minutes based on my runs of this protocol. You can also do these after the full moon, but it only takes a couple of days after the full moon until the moon is not rising until 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. So you're out in the wee hours, or you try to get up super early and fit it in before a half hour before sunrise. And I've tried this and I've failed. I've gotten to like the last two stops and run out of time, right? So that's very disappointing. So for me, it's an evening survey. And it's the 8 days before the full moon. So in May this year, that's 4 May to 12 May, the 12 May being the full moon. And in June, it's 3 June to 11 June. The protocol itself, so there is an established protocol. The Nightjar Survey Network has a protocol that's been around for about 15 years. It's just not very widely used, right? We need to increase its application. But it's a perfectly fine protocol. Again, it starts 30 minutes after sunset for evening surveys. The surveys are, again, we're using breeding bird survey route. This is the Norwood route, just in East Feliciana Parish, crosses over into West Feliciana Parish. There is a series of 10 different point counts located a mile apart on these 10 to 12 mile routes. Each point count is 6 minutes in duration. So it's only passive listening. So you're not using playback. You're not using spotlighting to look for eye shine or anything like that. A single observer conducts the count. But a partner is recommended, for safety and company and to help take notes and that sort of thing. But the partner cannot point out birds. It's a single person detection. And then the data are collected in 6 1-minute period bins. And I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. So I think going through the data sheet, and this is where we're getting really into the details. If you've already decided this is not for me, then my apologies, but I want to give everybody, the detail they need to make a call. Well, is this of interest to me or not? So I want to go through the data sheet, right? And so the top of the data sheet here, sort of route data. So the route name, observer, the date, the time you're starting, and that sort of thing. And then in the second part of the data sheet, we have weather and other stop specific data. So at every stop, we're going to take information on wind and cloud covering, that sort of thing. And so stops are arranged 1 through 10, the columns are each stop. And so, for wind, we have different codes. So 0 is calm. So at stop 1, I had wind as a 1, so light air. So you could see smoke moving, but it's very, very light. Almost calm, right? Sky, a number of codes here, clear being 0. So my sky here for stop 1 was 0. There was no noise. Noise is just a subjective scale from 0 to none to slight to moderate to excessive. And we're talking about like barking dogs or a train or a generator or whatever. And then is the moon visible? Yes or no? And then the number of cars that pass during your 6-minute survey. There is one other really sort of logistical challenging part of this. If you've got your moon right and your moon rise night right and all that, it's still a little bit dependent on weather, right? So we need the moon to be visible. We don't want to conduct these when it's overcast or foggy or raining. And we need the wind to be below about 8 miles per hour because it's really hard to hear these things at any distance if it's really windy. But say you've got all that in place and you can do your survey. This is the bird data. And so each detection of a nightjar gets its own line in the data sheet. So at stop 1 here, I'm starting at 8:47. And I detected 4 Chuck Wills widows. That's CWWI. And remember, there's 6 different minutes in which I'm collecting data during those individual minutes. 1 means I detected it. It doesn't matter if you heard it or saw it. It's 99.9% by ear. And a 0 is you did not detect it. So in this first minute of stop number 1, I heard 2 different Chuck Wills widows. Like one might have been over here, one over here. In the third minute, I didn't hear either of those birds, but I heard what I thought was a different bird, somewhere else, a different direction, distance, or whatever. And so that goes, there. That's a bit of a judgment call because one of those first birds could have moved, right? In this case, I was justified because in minute number 3, I heard all 3 of those birds calling, and I could tell that they're in different places, et cetera, right? In stop 2, I had 3 Chuck Wills widows, so they each get their own line. The first 2 birds I heard every minute of that 6-minute period. The third bird I didn't hear until the last 3 minutes, et cetera, et cetera. And so just going through sort of the motions of conducting one of these surveys. So after you arrive at your survey stop, you exit your vehicle, you wait 1 minute before starting your survey, and that's to let your vehicle engine stop making little noises and let any nightjars that might have been close sort of acclimate to your vehicle stopping or whatever. You can check your pull off, your safety. You can record your weather data, your moon data. And then after a minute, you start your stopwatch and you do your 6-minute point count. You're also making note of the 1-minute breaks within that, right? A partner is really helpful here. But only one person detects the birds. You record birds as you hear them rather than waiting till the 1-minute period is over because you will get confused. Don't use playback, no spotlights, all that. And as I mentioned, sometimes birds will move during the 6-minute count. You just have to use your best judgment when deciding if a new detection is actually a new bird or not. And you only record birds detected during the 6-minute count. If you do your 6-minute count and you have no nightjars, and then 5 seconds after you end, you have a nightjar, you can't count it. You can put it in the notes or the comments, but it doesn't go into the actual data. Now, there's one other part of this. Okay, sure. Yeah.
Can you use Merlin ID to identify the sound of it?
Yeah, you could use.
Record that as legit.
Yeah, you could use Merlin to sort of verify, what you're hearing, because like in general, I do not recommend relying on Merlin because it makes a lot of errors. But at night, when there's essentially nothing else singing, it's going to be fine for something like a chuckles, whatever. So there is one other component of this that's required, and that is making a daytime trip to your survey route, right? You can do this the afternoon of an evening survey, or you can do it a week ahead or whatever. But it's really important to go out and ground truth the route and the exact stop localities, right? So during this effort, you want to record and update information on the stop description data sheet. I'm going to talk about that next. And you need to be familiar with each stop to recognize it at night. You want to be able to take notes on landmarks. So if you were to decide to do this, I would send you a map and a route description, like a description of each stop, right? But it might not have been ground truthed yet. And even if it has, you need to do it yourself so that you who are running the survey at night can recognize the stops and can maybe, if you need to change a stop, do a safety issue, you can do that. You can move a particular stop up to 0.2 miles without affecting the route. And we're also recording habitat information at each stop. And so, like I went through the other data sheet, I do want to go through this real quick. So this is the stop description data sheet. And so, stops here 1 through 10, you have your lat long, you get to a point, you decide that point works for you based on the information that you've been given and what you're seeing on the ground, right? In this case, I didn't write it here, but there was a really good pull off right here for the stop number 1. So I recorded a lat long. You can do this from your phone. If you don't know how to do that, I can teach you how to do that. Then you write your own description, right? If it's different from the one on the data on the sheet that you receive, or if it's not, right? In this case, I wrote the junction of Highway 786 and Parish Road 227. And then in parentheses, continue north on 227 after this stop. So you're doing this in the daylight. One of the things we want to collect information on is the number of buildings visible from that stop. And the dominant habitat. Dominant habitat based on these very general categories here within 100 meters of your point. In this case, I chose E, pine dominated upland forest, right? The other thing you want to do, and I don't have a space for it on this data sheet, I might revise it to have such a thing, but is an odometer for your particular vehicle. Like you will get an odometer or a mileage reading when you get a description of the route. But it's important that you do it in your own vehicle because vehicles differ. So in this case, my second stop was exactly 1.1 miles down the road, right? I reset my odometer at stop 1. This is an old pull off on the right at the start of a clear cut. So in this case, it was really straightforward. There was forest on both sides of the road. And then at some point that gave way to a clear cut on the right. And there was a pull off right there. And that's the stop. And so sort of, so on and so on. In some cases, there aren't really good landmarks, like stop number 3, 50 meters shy of mailboxes, that sort of thing. But that's generally what you need to do during that part of this. Safety is obviously a really, really big deal for a nighttime survey. I can't overstate this. Many people are probably thinking right now, I'm not comfortable doing that, and I completely get it. If you think you're not comfortable doing that, you're probably not. You probably, shouldn't try, right? But if you think you might be, then I would certainly invite your participation. So some of the safety guidance that we provide is survey in a group of two, if at all possible, right? Park well off the road during survey stops. Hopefully, in most cases, you actually have a pull off to use. If not, you want to pull off completely. Leave your parking lights on, like constant burn, during your point counts, not flashing, but just constant. Wear a reflective vest, wear a headlamp. You really need a headlamp to fill out the data sheet anyway. So that's really helpful. I like to notify the local sheriff's office of my activity, my route, when I'm going to be there. And if you feel unsafe at any time, you stop the survey and you leave and you go home and you let me know, this was happening. Some, guy wanted to talk to me and I didn't feel safe. And so I left. And we'll try to mitigate that, figure it out, or we'll decide that that's just not a safe route. And so, in summary, and I'll just go through this super quick because I've provided a lot of information. This is an easy survey birdwise, really. You only need to know the songs of one or well, two species, three max. But you do need good hearing because you do need to hear at a distance and be able to figure out which direction birds are coming from so that you can sort of keep different individuals straight. The challenging part is the logistics, right? It's nighttime. That obviously has its own challenges. The moon phase is critical. There's really only one ideal week per month for those evening surveys, which is my priority. That's really, after doing this a few times, that's really the only thing that I try. And you need good weather. So you got to be, once you have that week identified and you've got your nights that you're available, you really have to pay attention to the weather. And then routes, or some distance from where we mostly live, as you could have noticed from that map of the breeding bird survey routes. So, like I mentioned before, volunteers are going to be, critical for really this to be a successful program long term. And so, if you are interested, then please reach out to me for more details. And that's my email. And that's all I got. Sure.
The nightjar is less likely to run into windows at night.
The question was, are nightjars less likely to run into windows at night? It certainly happens. I don't know where they rank in terms of likelihood of compared to other birds.
Decline in population to the reason this happened?
No, that has not been done. For nightjars and most birds in general, there are a multitude of reasons why the birds are declining, but pinpointing those reasons and ranking them with respect to different guilds and those declines, has not really been done. For most of these birds, it's habitat loss and degradation, right? And then specific causes of mortality like collisions play into that as well to some degree, right? That certainly varies, but it hasn't been teased out by guild.
It seems to me that the insects that are devout,
yes,
yes, less likely to have pesticide poison.
Yeah, for nightjars and for aerial insectivores in general, insect declines are certainly thought to be a really important factor. And folks are working on that right now, right? But at this point, it hasn't really been quantified very well or teased apart. There's a lot of research going on right now.
Well, there's been a lot of sightings of birds outside their normal migration routes or territories. Has there been a paraki sighted in Louisiana?
There's never been a paraki sighted in Louisiana, no. Nor a common four-wheel, which I kind of also think would be a really good candidate for occurring in Louisiana. They're migratory, right? They've occurred as far east as, central Kansas, central Oklahoma. Yeah.
Find nightjars in Baton Rouge?
So nightjars, so the question was, do you ever find nightjars in Baton Rouge? Nightjars definitely occur in Baton Rouge during migration. I'm not, it's possible that, I don't know if Chuck Will's widow has bred close enough to Baton Rouge to be like in a Breck Park or anything. I'm not sure about that. as I said, most the Chuck-Will's widows that breed sort of in this part of the state are a little bit farther up in the Florida parishes, and they're fairly low density scattered. I don't know if there's documented presence of one during the breeding season in a Baton Rouge area, natural area. I'm not sure, but common nighthawks for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sort of in that sort of Nightjar, Chuck-Will's widow zone. Nighthawks certainly breed in Baton Rouge. Yeah, nighthawks. I mentioned that they're habitat generalists, that they like those open areas. They'll actually nest on gravel rooftops. That happens in a number of areas. It occurs in I think in Lafayette, although I've not documented that, but yeah.
30, 50 years ago, they used to have a pretty good colony over in southeast.
Common nighthawks.
They had a lot of gravel roofs. They were walking around the campus and the way that in the early evening, they were everywhere.
Yeah. So the commenter says that there used to be a sizable population of common nighthawks, southeastern Louisiana University in Hammond. That's where you're talking about. Yeah. And you've noticed fewer these days. Is that what I? Yeah. I mean, there's almost certainly many fewer these days. I talk to folks pretty regularly in northern Louisiana about Chuck-Will's widow, right? That's the nightjar that is common up there. Everybody calls them whippoorwills, right? But they're not technically whippoorwills. But the point is that almost everybody I talk to, rural folks, lament the decline in these birds, right? Everybody's noticed it. Everybody who used to sit out on their porch and pay attention has noticed that there are very many fewer now. Yeah. In the back.
Moved here in 1952, and nighthawks were everywhere.
Yeah.
That's my memories.
Right. Yeah.
No, I think there were a lot of nighthawks.
Yeah.
Nested on the flat roofs. And
Yeah.
fire over the football field.
Right. Yeah. Do you have a question, Beth?
So on cloudy nights or during the day, do they fly or they just held up someplace?
So the question is on cloudy days or moonless nights, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Do they just stay put? And so it really differs between nighthawks and nightjars. Like we said, nighthawks tend to be active during the day, so they're not so much affected by that. But with respect to nightjars, they simply don't forage as much. Like during the dark part of the moon, they simply don't forage as much. And that's a really interesting component of their biology, right? How do they do that? One thing that has been documented, at least to some degree, is that they time their breeding to match up with the lunar, like with the bright moon, so that they're feeding kids during the brighter moon when they can better find food and provision growing kids. Yeah, but yeah, my understanding is that during the dark moon, they're simply not as active. Yeah. And there must be a really, interesting evolutionary component of that to allow that, because you're comparing to other migratory birds that are breeding in the same area that have, several times the amount of time during any given day to forage. Yeah. Pretty interesting.
You referenced the Birds Record Committee
Yeah.
to validate sightings.
Yeah.
What's that?
The Louisiana Bird Records Committee is a committee of the Louisiana Ornithological Society, and they maintain the official state checklist, maintain a list of called review list birds that we request documentation of to be able to verify or at least evaluate the validity of those records to maintain a sort of a scientifically based understanding of the status and occurrence of different birds in the state. So photographs, videos, and audio recordings. Yeah. Now, in the absence of that, really good written details, and or, sketches, as much detail as you can provide in a written form. That would be referred to as a site record, and those are often completely acceptable and legitimate. Yep. Unless it's like such a rare bird that you really like. There's a bit of a policy now, like for a first state record, certainly a first state record, or maybe even a second or third state record, really need a photo or some sort of photographic evidence. Yeah. Yeah.
Ellen is an artist, so she might.
Oh yeah, cool. Right. Oh yeah, yeah.
Natural selection affects the population of naturals.
The question is, how does natural selection affect the population of nightjars? Well, that's a tough question. Right. Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, that's the way we should all be thinking about all this stuff. Like everything we talk about in science, in biology, it all makes more sense when you think about it in the context of evolution, and which is primarily based on natural selection. One thing that I talked about was sexual selection. Do you remember that when we talked about the birds with the really elongated tails? That is a form of natural selection. And in that case, like the females are selecting a specific trait in males. And so what happens is those males that possess that extra long tail, they mate more, they are able to mate more frequently, they have more kids. And so their genes, right, that have that extra long tail component become more common in the population in general. And so that sort of perpetuates that trait within that population. So that's sort of one way. Yeah.
Speaking of mating, how many eggs do they usually in a clutch?
Two.
Two.
Yeah.
And they actually, do they, like killdeer, do they sit on the ground?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
Yep. They sit on the ground. And they'll do, like killdeer, they'll do distraction displays. If you they don't like necessarily drag the wing, but they'll sort of flutter off and call and sort of try to lead you away by just flapping around.
and clearly that's not one of the reasons for the decline. Like,
No.
it's not an introduction of another species or something like that.
I mean, how invasive species are affecting forest structure, that can certainly affect that, right? But no, like human disturbance at an individual nest is not probably one of the primary drivers. Now, how we are affecting, forest structure through management or conversion or whatever, that's certainly affecting these birds' populations.
But unfortunately, it's not one that you can go, like bluebird, you can go build a house.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean, the best way to do that, is to provide the habitat conditions that they really need. And so like in upland pine forest in Louisiana, that would be implementing prescribed fire to sort of try to create an open understory and gaps in the forest. So these birds are they're aerial insectivores, right? And so they need that sort of open area to be able to search for those insects. And so in an unmanaged forest in northern Louisiana, for example, it's such a thick understory because there's no fire really, or there's no techniques mimicking fire to keep that understory a little bit open, that the birds just don't have the foraging ability, sort of space, right? Yeah. And so one way is to manage forests either with fire or other mechanical practices to sort of mimic the historical conditions as much as possible. Yeah.
I have one question about the survey routes. Everything in Louisiana is based on a breeding bird survey route.
At this point in time.
That what's going on just in Louisiana, or since it's a protocol that you picked up from.
Yeah.
Are they all?
There's variation, in large part, in most areas that the Nightjar survey network protocol has been implemented. It's been focused mainly on breeding bird survey routes, but not exclusively. Yeah, there's some variation, but that's sort of the baseline. Yeah.
Significantly fewer stops than a breeding bird survey.
Yeah, it only takes hour and 45-ish minutes.
50 is.
Yeah, that takes 5 hours. Right.
It's not that
Yeah.
How are the routes assigned? You just pick one, or how's that work?
Yeah, so if you're interested in one, you would let me know, and if it's available, which most of them are, then we would assign you that route. I'm gonna have a Zoom call for folks who are actually gonna participate like late April to sort of go through details again and that sort of thing. But I would communicate with you one-on-one as far as what your route preference is, and that's right. If we get a lot of observers, which would be great, we'll probably have backup, like reserve surveyors, because there's 1 week in May, an assigned participant might not be able to get to it, right? And we could call on a reserve. Because I hate to wait until June, because then if the weather's terrible in that 1 week in June, then you're kind of shot for the year. So we might have to go that route. Cool. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you, everybody who joined online. I didn't see any questions in the chat there. I'm going to close it down. Just a reminder again about the presentation next month, again, May 1st. I think probably unlikely that we're going to be able to record that one. So everybody in the room tends to show up in person anyway. Everybody on Zoom or who tends to show up virtually, just a heads up that may not be an option given who our speaker is May 1st. All right, thank you. Yeah, Jane's on Zoom.
Good, good, thank you.
Thanks.
I know, right?
All right, thank you, guys.
There's
Thank-
something running a book right now on